I'm glad you're all here. It seems to be there's still a few empty chairs, but we'll go forward as we are. The first speaker is Chuck Lewis, somebody who we had a significant knowledge of his work when we first started here 12 years ago, because the Center for Public Integrity in Washington was a signal place for a lot of us to give up an emphasis on government corruption and government malfeasance and all the rest of it, and mass murder, if you will. And the only people really documenting that in a systemic, organized fashion at that point in the States was really the Center for Public Integrity, amongst others. And further, they also had an enormous influence on us because the center itself also had data and serious work done on data. In fact, one of the guys that I first met at the center is now the head of all digital at The Guardian, Aaron Pilhofer. And they were doing invaluable work in data processing, which was unique then at that time to the Center for Public Integrity. The founder is Chuck Lewis, and he's here and going to speak next. And he's just written a book documenting the 935 lies of the former U.S. presidency. I'm sure we can do the same thing in the next one, but it's an invaluable exercise. But towards that end, a man that many of you will already know, Chuck Lewis.
Sorry, I'll explain that in a sec. Anyway, it's great to be here, and I just want to say, Gavin and Sarah and everyone that's participated, this is an amazing conference. Most journalists go to journalism conferences, and they don't get out much and outside their realm, and so the interplay of all these interesting and all public-minded folks in one room is somewhat unusual, at least in my experience. And the Logan family and the foundation made it possible. I wanted to, we're only talking about the future of truth, a small subject here. And in fact, it's a very short subject. I'm going to spend more time looking backwards, naturally. But that's what journalists do. Anyway, I've been doing investigative reporting like many here for many years, over 30 years. And I was at ABC News and CBS News, working with Lowell at 60 Minutes and others, and quit one day because they spiked my story for not the first time. And so I started the Center for Public Integrity from my house. A few years later, started the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and we have journalists here, Nikki Hager and Duncan Campbell, and in London, of course, Philip Knightley and others. So this is 185 journalists now in 65 countries on 6 continents, doing the first reporting across borders systematically from journalists from all over different organizations. It's been a little bit of a strange, what's that long, strange journey it's been? That would be what we're describing here. I ran it for 15 years. Bill Busenberg is stepping down after 8 years, and Peter Bale is in the audience, the next leader of the center and the International Consortium. We did do systematic, just a sentence on that. We did books like The Buying of the President in 96, 2000, 2004, looking at every penny in the life of presidential candidates over decades and looking at their top 10 career patrons to see what those folks got back for their money, which of course was a lot. And we looked at The Buying of the Congress with 1,200 interviews, 36 researchers, writers, editors. So we were anal retentive in the extreme. There's no other way to describe it. We looked at corruption in all 50 states back in the 90s. We were working with 45 newspapers in 45 states. So we do these kind of gone with the wind epic things. On national security, since obviously a lot of this conference is about that subject, we weren't the only ones to do this, but we did a report called The Business of War in 2002, tracking the 90 private military companies on planet Earth, including Kellogg Brown and Root, which was, of course, part of Halliburton. In 03, we posted the Patriot II Act against the wishes of the Attorney General. We were told that we'd be very sorry if we published that within 2 weeks of the invasion of Iraq. We published it anyway, quoted whoever said that, and had 350,000 unique visitors and 15 million hits and 100 news stories the next day, including in the Post, Washington Post, and New York Times. And we posted all the Iraq and Afghanistan war contracts. Because of the web, it enabled you to see who was getting rich from war in real time during the war. And we filed 73 Freedom of Information Act requests. And we went to federal court. Halliburton, of course, did not want its $7 billion no-bid contract released. Funny how that works. And we got it in the courts, and we posted all those contracts within 6 to 12 months. The first 6 months, most of them. I think Halliburton took us a few more months to get it. So that's the kind of mischief that the center does, and it's just as many in Europe would know, of course, the secrecy bank records things that have been going on both in Luxembourg and also more largely the world, with dozens of laws starting to change in countries because of that report, involving 115 journalists in 55 or 60 countries, which I think might be the biggest single collaboration ever. So I left the center. At some point, the founder has to leave the building if it's going to actually be an institution, and I now run the Investigative Reporting Workshop at American University. We've done Frontlines, co-produced Frontline documentaries, 6 of them. Showtime on climate change, partnered with the New York Times on immigration detention, solitary confinement. The New Yorker regarding the Koch brothers and the climate change legislation dying in Washington, not coincidentally. So anyway, that's sort of where I'm coming from. At the end of '04, I realized that I had my whole life focused on this old cliche, watch what they do, watch what they say, not what they do. Investigative journalists generally assume that those in power lie. I know we're so cynical, but so most of the time journalists are really focused on contracts and agreements and charters and emails and leaks, yes, but it's usually the substance of the material, not the statements. And also, of course, we also distrust public relations people. That's another understatement here. And so, as a result, I ignored all those folks. And then I noticed at the end of 2004, just a few months as I'm stepping down, I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, among other things. I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting? I noticed that 60% of Americans at the end of '04 and early '05 still thought there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq a year after George W. Bush himself said they didn't find them. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm not a deep philosopher, but I think, what does it mean if the public actually doesn't want to accept the truth? And as late as 2012, 60% of Republicans still, in some polls, still believe they were there. And I thought, well, that's kind of, whoa, I mean, I should probably go to a shrink or something. This is serious stuff. And then I thought, well, but also, what's it say about journalism? If facts don't matter anymore, we have a serious professional crisis about what we do. So this anal retentive DNA thing is a real problem, because then I got 8 or 9 researchers, and we looked at every false and erroneous statement made by President Bush, Dick Cheney, the vice president, and 6 other top officials. And we worked for 2.5 years and did a 380,000-word database of every utterance that fit that the criteria. And we did a report called Iraq, the War Card, and we issued it on I gave it to the center to release. I had left the center, but I thought that would be a good thing. It was a 5-year anniversary of the invasion. And it was covered massively around the world. BBC did 3 stories, NPR Morning Edition, AP, New York Times had it first. And the White House, of course, denounced it within hours, not surprising. And so then I realized, of course, and I did know this, I'm not as dumb as I look, I actually did realize that this has happened before as a student of history, like we all are. And so, of course, I felt the need to start looking at all of these issues and going back, hold on to your seats, 50-plus years. The other obvious war, which we've had, I don't know if he's still in here, but Dan Ellsberg, the Vietnam War, where 58,000 U.S. military alone died. Iraq, as you're probably aware, that war has cost, in just the U.S. alone, $2 trillion, 60 to 80,000 contractors or soldiers from the U.S. will be permanently disabled the rest of their life. and of course 100,000 and probably far higher of civilian casualties. So these are obviously immensely serious issues. Vietnam, the casualties, of course, were massive, and in terms of U.S. military casualties, far worse actually than Iraq. And so I went back and revisited all that, the Pentagon Papers, the gaps in time, the fact that the President of the United States is telling Americans, I'm not going to send our boys to Vietnam. He always had problems pronouncing that country's name. And of course, meanwhile, there are secret memos about Operation Rolling Thunder. They're going to put 500,000 boots on the ground or more the following spring. And of course, for months, they knew the U.S. was invading the land, water, and airspace of North Vietnam prior to the quote-unquote attack that actually did not occur on August 4th, '64. So the public doesn't really understand the full dimension, of course, until 1971, thanks to Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, New York Times, Washington Post, and other papers breaking that, and the U.S. Supreme Court almost censoring that, but allowing it, an amazing moment in U.S. history. But I kept going back. I went back to the McCarthy years, the Red Scare in the U.S., and examined the role of lying and false statements, the media's role, which was not particularly courageous initially. Everyone had to take a loyalty oath about the CIA at all three networks. Dozens of reporters were fired because they were seen as either disloyal or undependable about their political views. I looked at race issues, this is way before Ferguson, and I looked systematically at the fact that the New York Times didn't have a bureau in the southern part of the United States until 1947. They had a bureau here in Paris and some other very nice cities, but not the South. And of course, the Brown versus Board case and lots of other things. It's too long to go deep in it, but I interviewed leading and civil rights activists who are still living from that period. I've talked to Cy Hirsch, and this is what this project became. I started to also look at great moments where the journalists got it right. That would not be Iraq, and even Vietnam. Obviously, we had a war resolution within 6 days of the faux invasion. The faux attack, on August 4th. Within 6 days, there was a war resolution. That's how bad it was. 85% of America's newspapers saluted, started singing the Star-Spangled Banner, and we went to war. So those two wars, the best reporting was obviously the Pentagon Papers, which was leaked, and the other best reporting was Cy Hirsch, who was not in Vietnam. He was in Washington, a freelancer. He can't get anyone in Washington. 30 news organizations would not publish the story. Because who's this guy? He's a freelance writer, et cetera. So anyway, but obviously the huge stories when they finally did occur, but most of the reporting about Vietnam was dutiful and quite patriotic, and there were not, it was not particularly impressive reporting for the most part. There were great moments of individual war correspondents, some of whom were killed. I'm not saying there weren't folks in the field, but overall the coverage was relatively loyal and deferential. Of course, the Watergate scandal for this, I'm not going to go through the site, but there's 51 produced segments totaling 4 hours. Luminaries like my former colleague, Lowell Bergman, but Cy Hirsch, Carl Bernstein, who I worked for a year, Bob Woodward, Ben Bradley, who just died, and lots of journalists going back, 50-plus years. The man who brought down Senator McCarthy, who just died a year ago, Murray Martyr at age 93, who studied every move McCarthy made for 4 years, literally in-depth journalism in real time, and he was the one who asked questions that were inconvenient that set up the famous Army hearings that brought down McCarthy. How many journalists today can spend 4 years on any story, just that? That's kind of revealing in a way. Bernstein and Woodward did several hundred stories, and they were on that story for 2.5 full years. They had a Watergate editor, Barry Sussman, who put them together, who I interviewed, who's still around, thankfully. So when I look at great moments of truth in the last half century, journalism, when it's done exceptionally well, takes time, it costs money, et cetera, et cetera. And we know that I'll come around the bend about journalism. Journalism, obviously, in the last 10, 15 years, commercial journalism, we've lost about 15 or more thousand commercial journalists. But meanwhile, there's 100 nonprofits. When Lowell and 3 other journalists started the Center for Investigative Reporting in 1977, it was the first nonprofit doing investigative reporting in the world, as far as I know, U.S. certainly. And the Center for Public Integrity was the second. Now there's 100 of them. Now, not all of them are strictly as hardcore investigative as CPI and CIR, but there's still something really interesting happening. The diaspora of immensely talented journalists moved to the nonprofit space. But anyway, if you go to the top, I'm not going to play around on the site, but if you go to the top of this site, it has interviews and bio profiles of the 25 journalists. I'm still adding. I just interviewed Betty Metzger, who did the COINTELPRO story about FBI surveillance of Americans, and so that'll go up soon. I hope to do 40 or 50 of these interviews by the time I'm finished. And that was the first time, to my knowledge, an American newspaper had secret classified records, and they were asked by the FBI not to publish, and they said, we're publishing anyway. And Ben Bradley went to Katharine Graham, argued, we got to publish, and they published the COINTEL story. That's 2 or 3 months before the Pentagon Papers, actually. So it's most journalists, and even I'd say most people, don't know what I just said. That's sort of some of the secrets of the recent past that some of us lived through are all, some of them still just coming out. It's very strange, but true. The one other part of, so anyway, I've neglected to mention, oh, by the way, I did this book called 935 Lies, which is the false statements that we tracked, but the publisher wanted to use the L word, so we did, and which I'm fine with. If you notice the memoirs, I don't recommend anyone read this stuff, but if you read Bush and Cheney's and Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and all these folks' memoirs, they all have the same phrase. They all say that they had bad intelligence, which you could fill in the laugh line there. I'll let you fill it in. It speaks for itself. But none of them had any, like the slightest contrition or apology or humility about what occurred here with that. The biggest lies, though, in U.S. history that have caused the largest loss of life are not the Holocaust. It's not World War I or World War II. It's not any of the things that we're talking about. It's actually tobacco. There were, according to the World Health Organization, 100 million people died from smoking in the 20th century. This century it will be 1 billion. Why? Because ever since the late 70s, every U.S. trade representative, part of the White House, for every president, since Jimmy Carter to today with Barack Obama, they have all helped tobacco companies pry open markets around the world in the name of free trade, so that they can grow tobacco, sell tobacco, and make sure, of course, children and others buy it. And so the exponential numbers of who will smoke will grow as the older countries like Britain and the U.S., who first their surgeon generals or health officials started noticing it was killing people back in actually UK was ahead of the U.S. 2 or 3 years. But anyway, there's a whole chapter on tobacco. Why? Because for 60 years, from 1940 to 2000, journalists had trouble telling that story. I'll spare you, but I go through every example that I've ever heard of, and it's quite a number, from George Seldes, who starts a newsletter called In Fact. He's mad because Associated Press and Reader's Digest are the only two telling people that there's studies showing that smoking kills, which, of course, the tobacco industry denies. And all the way up, of course, to, yes, The Insider at the end of or in the mid-90s, but you have 2 other documentaries that I talk about, one that was killed outright the same day as another one. The network settled. I'll spare you all the details, but if you want to know all the examples of problems where journalists in the U.S. could not cover tobacco, it's pretty disgusting. I could tell you a lot of stories, but it would be wrong, because there's a time thing here. But if you want to hear them, I'll tell you. I had some of my own, and actually, as I mentioned, one of my stories was spiked. It wasn't as dramatic as The Insider, but it was another thing that bothered me, and it wasn't the last straw. It was not the first story spiked, but it was the last one, because I walked and broke a 4-year contract and had a mortgage and a wife and a 8 or 9-year-old daughter, and no savings. Other than that, it was a really good idea. So it started the center with two friends who didn't know each other on the board. I naturally had to be in charge of it. The thing that you've been passed out, just to close the loop on some of the truth things, I just want to show you how bad this is. Our biggest problem, and there's been other discussions about, for those of you who don't have it, I'll get it up on the, there's a website for the book called 935lies.com, and I'll get this is my favorite part of the book, the appendix. But it actually has examples. Let me tell you how bad this is. We find out the truth not like a week later, not a month later, not a year later. We find out decades later how bad things are. And that's in the so-called good old days when we had many more journalists, commercial journalists. And so if you look at, I'll just give a few examples. Gosh, where do I start? There's so many. I have 20 here, 10 and 10. I'm just going to do a handful, just a few. Lead paint. There's an ad campaign focusing on children and saying lead paint helps guard your health. And it was in the walls of schools in 1923. And they promoted it in hospitals as well. In the U.S., at least, President Nixon signs the Lead-Based Paint Poisoning Prevention Act. The first real major news stories in the U.S., at least, were in 1943, 20 years later, and later in the 50s with CBS and Parade. Asbestos. The industry executives knew their product was killing people way back in the 1930s. Their internal memos, 1934. The first major comprehensive scientific study that it kills was 1964. We're talking 30 years, right? And the first most substantial journalism is Paul Brodeur in New Yorker in 1968 and others that follow. The British decided black lung was a compensable condition back in 1943, coal miners and dust standards. And the U.S. doesn't get around to doing it until 25 years later, roughly. 1969, the U.S. passes the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act. The first notable reporting in the U.S., many would say, is in the 1960s by journalists, because there's a West Virginia coal mine disaster. So that's some of the things. But on government, besides what we just talked about with Vietnam, maybe the most outrageous single one, but I don't know, you tell me. There's so many. The U.S. Public Health Service launched a study into how people who have syphilis die. And so they gave uninformed black men, They gave uninformed black males, 600 of them, placebo pills, useless pills, telling them they were being cured. They all, of course, die. The public doesn't find out about this for 40 years, till 1972, when someone inside the Public Health Service leaked it to Gene Heller of the AP, Associated Press. The radiation experiments, thousands of people were exposed, and in some cases, people were injected with plutonium. Can you imagine getting a shot from the doctor, plutonium? That's not made public and revealed until Eileen Wellsome does a series in the Albuquerque Tribune in 1993, and the president, at the time Clinton, takes a commission report that lays out the whole misleading things that happened there. Anyway, you get the idea. It's really quite extensive. Now, what does that mean for the future? Well, it means we have a problem here. We've never gotten it right in real time, hardly ever, exceedingly rarely. One of the few times we got it right, journalists, I mean, was actually, someone mentioned El Salvador today, the El Mozote massacre. Alma Guillermo Prieto of the Washington Post and, the New York Times reporter, I'm blanking on, Ray Bonner, sorry, who I talked to in the book. Sorry, it's been a long day. And both of them had the story, hundreds of dead bodies over a period of, over a little area of ground in a little village called El Mozote. The U.S. government knows about it. It's on page 1 of both newspapers. Susan Meiselas, Pulitzer-winning photographer, takes a photo that's in both papers. That story goes all over the world. The Reagan administration testifies and says, you know, actually, we think they're really improving in human rights, and completely ignored this. And they also said that the left was trying to distort, foreign policy. The truth emerges 10 years later with a Truth Commission by the UN in El Salvador, where they literally dig up the bones, hundreds of skeletons, and oh yes, by the way, U.S.-made bullets from the massacre we were helping the government of El Salvador. So that's a case where they got it right in real time, within days of the massacre, but then they were spun by the White House to not do it. So we know enough from just recently with Iraq and even what's happening now with Iraq 3, how easily the press is bamboozled. It could be related that we have 5 times more public relations people today than we did back in 1960 when Kennedy and Nixon debated, and we had a big election back then. Anyway, so when you have that many people spinning, you have the government has its own TV channel, the Pentagon News Channel, and they're sending out video news releases and there's 100 million people exposed during the Iraq War to videos prepared by the Bush administration, paid by taxpayers. That's the most outrageous part of all. No, I'm just kidding. But you can see why we're bamboozled. Obama has more people spinning than Bush did in the White House. Bush had more than Clinton. There's fewer reporters, full-time professional reporters in the White House today than there were under Bush and then after. So these trends are all fairly disturbing. And that's why this conference is so important, because the role of citizens, the role of public interest-minded folks who are gathering information in various ways, whether it's, yes, leaked material, whether it's whistleblowers coming forward, or both, or, and yes, public interest-minded journalists, which we could use more of, by the way. All of those things will help change this dynamic, but the dynamic, the tradition, the pattern is journalists get it late. They don't get it first, they get it last. And investigative reporting is not daily reporting. And obviously, and even daily reporting is mostly too frequently, there's a need for it, yes, but stenography, taking down what they said, which of course could be bloviating when you have 935 statements all made by the same basic statements by 8 people. David Barstow won the Pulitzer Prize. He found emails, thousands of pages of Freedom of Information materials. He found emails from the Pentagon directly to 75 generals and admirals who were former generals, of course, but a third of them were contractors getting rich from military contracts, and they were all doing objective, independent analysis on TV, saying the war was going very well, and that Guantanamo is a really pretty nice place. They went down on the Vice President's personal jet, and they thought it seemed fine to them. That's what passes for coverage, and it's what passes for truth, and we have to do better. And I guess I should stop there. I could go on for about a couple of days, but it would be wrong. Thank you very much.